Okay, tonight's class is on Federalist Paper 41. Now, if you remember, some of the Anti-Federalists were arguing that in the Constitution, they were a little angry at the delegates because they didn't put any provision in the Constitution against a standing army. And they handled that back in 24, but it rears its head again in 41. And so in 41, he's talking about the general view of the powers conferred by the Constitution. So one thing we have to realize is government is nothing more than an expression of power, is it not? All government is an expression of power. That's really what the crux of the argument was about. The Anti-Federalists didn't want the states to lose power, and they thought that giving power to a federal government, any power to a federal government, would result in a monarchy just like they had before. And so they were worried about that. Madison was very clear in understanding that we needed a federal government because if we didn't, if each state had all the same powers of war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, that what would happen is we would devolve to the city-states of Europe. And he even says so here in 41, brings that out. In 24, if you remember, Hamilton argued that we shouldn't have a provision in there against a standing army for like what they had learned in history. But he said that we did need a somewhat of a force, right? So one of the biggest things that our founding fathers looked at is balance in everything, right? Checks and balances. So they believed that if there's a threat, that you have to have the requisite power to repel that threat. Not too much, not too little, right? So the whole thing with our Constitution and our Republican form of government is not too much government, not too little government, but the right amount of government. That's what it was all about. So they realized that certain powers bring about certain dangers, but they put certain safeguards in place to try to deal with those potential dangers, to reap the good from the good that it provided, but then to provide for the dangers that it provided also. So Federalist 41 kind of really highlights a lot of that deliberation and the things they looked at when they did what they did. And that's why I like 41. That's why I picked one. You know, there's 85. I'm only going over 10. The reason why I went 41 is one of those 10 is because it demonstrates that. So this is Federalist Paper number 41. It's published on the 19th of January, 1788. It's published by Madison in the Independent Journal. And as they all start out, to the people of the state of New York. The Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered under two general points of view. The first relates to the sum or quantity of power which it vests in the government, including the restraints imposed on the states. Where do we find the restraints imposed on the states in the Constitution? Article 4. The second, to the particular structure of the government. Okay, so how is the government put together? It's a structure. And the distribution of this power among its several branches. Under the first view of the subject, two important questions arise. One, whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper. So right now, each state is sovereign and has all of the same powers as every other sovereign country in the world. Each state does. So they know that if they put up together a federal government, that federal government has to have certain powers. Where does it get those certain powers? From the states. It's delegated to the federal government from the states. Delegated. Not given up, not surrendered, but delegated. And so, first question they're going to look at is any of it unnecessary or improper? So what we're asking the states to delegate to the federal government, is it unnecessary or is it improper? So that's what they want to look, that's the first question. Second, whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left in the several states. So whatever power that the state delegates to the federal government, does that pose a danger to the state for the federal government to have that power and the state not to have that power? So those are the two important questions. Is the aggregate power of the general government greater than ought to have been vested in it? This is the first question. You cannot have escaped those who have attended with candor to the arguments employed against the extensive power of the government, that the authors of them have very little considered how far these powers were necessary means of attaining a necessary end. They have chosen rather to dwell on the inconveniences which must be unavoidably blended with all political advantages. So he's saying it's not perfect, there are some dangers, but you have to take the good with the bad. And does the good outweigh the bad? And if there is bad, how do we prevent from that? And on the possible abuses which must be incident to every power or trust, of which a beneficial use can be made. Is that true? Yes. Anybody that carries a gun has those same things, right? It's immense power to do some very horrible damage, but used properly, it can save a lot of lives, can't it? So, with everything comes both pros and cons, and we have to weigh that out. And how is that going to work? This method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the display the subtlety of the writer. It may open a boundless field of rhetoric and declamation. It may inflame the passions of the unthinking and may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. Think about that. The unthinking and the misthinking. We have that today, don't we? We have the unthinking, the people that are DNFU. Does anybody know what DNFU is? Dead from the neck up. And then you've got those that misthink. Those are the ones that watch the Communist News Network. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect good. How does our Constitution start out? In order to form a more perfect union, not in order to form a perfect union, right? So they understand that there is no utopia on earth, but we can always strive for excellence. And that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, as the next will, in case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. Okay? So just like the gun, there's the possibility that that power can be used for evil, right? So what do we do to balance that potential evil against the potential good that it can bring? In all situations are that way, right? I remember my oldest daughter got thrown out of 7th grade one day because the teacher said guns are bad. She said, no, they're not. She said, I can set a gun on that table and it won't kill anybody. And she said, a ratchet wrench is just as dangerous as a gun in the wrong hands. The teacher debated her on that, my 7th grader. My teacher said, yeah, if you got a stupid mechanic that doesn't tighten bolts up the way they're supposed to and you're going down the road, your ball joint falls off, you run into a tree and kill you, it's just as dangerous, isn't it? So any tool is dangerous in the wrong hands, and it brings about a greater good in the right hands. So this is exactly what our founders understood. This is the critical thinking that the unthinking and the misthinking aren't doing. Thank God we had calmer heads that were in that delegation. That we may form a correct judgment of this subject, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union. And that this may be the more conveniently done, they may be reduced into different classes as they relate to the following different objects. 1, security against foreign danger. 2, regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations. That's your interstate, or that's your foreign commerce. Okay. 3, maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. So that's interstate commerce. 4, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. 5, restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. And 6, provisions for giving due efficacy to all these powers. These guys were brilliant. The powers falling within the first class are those of declaring war and granting letters of marque, of providing armies and fleets, of regulating and calling forth the militia, of levying and borrowing money. Okay, that's for the general defense, right? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, for the common welfare and general, for the general welfare and common defense. Security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of civil society. It is an avowed and essential object of the American Union. The powers requisite for attaining it must be effectually confided to the federal councils, right? Each state can't defend however each state wants to defend if the Union is attacked, right? So this is one of the reasons why we needed a federal government, and a federal government then to have that power to defend the Union against a foreign invasion or a foreign attack. Is the power of declaring war necessary? No man will answer this question in the negative. It would be superfluous, therefore, to enter into a proof of the affirmative. The existing confederation establishes this power in the most ample form. Is the power of raising armies and equipping fleets necessary? This is involved in the foregoing power. It is involved in the power of self-defense, not aggression, not a military-industrial complex to go to other countries and tell them what kind of government they should have, but self-defense. But was it necessary to give an indefinite power of raising troops as well as providing fleets and of maintaining both in peace as well as in war? The answer to these questions has been too far anticipated in another place to admit an extensive discussion of them in this place. He's saying we already talked about it in 24. The answer indeed seems to be so obvious and conclusive as scarcely to justify such a discussion in any place. With what color of propriety could the force necessary for defense be limited by those who cannot limit the force of offense? If a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set bounds to the exertions of all other nations, then indeed might it prudently chain the discretion of its own government and set bounds to the exertions for its own safety. So what they're saying is, our Constitution's not going to stop the military buildup of Britain. It's not going to stop the military buildup of France. It's not going to stop the military buildup of Spain. If we could do that with our federal Constitution, then we would just write it into law, like a gun law, and then we wouldn't need an army or a navy. See, this is the foolish thing about gun laws, right? Well, we've got these mass shootings, so we've got to take guns away from the regular people. Well, that's like pulling everybody's driver's license because somebody else was drinking and driving. It doesn't stop the drinking and driving. So this is the same concept. If with a law we could stop the offense, then why don't we just write the law and stop the offense? But we can't. That's why we have to have a certain amount of troops and a certain amount of navy maintained so that we have the appropriate amount of defense against any offense that might be used against us. See, this is why you never see a police station or a gun show or a Dunkin' Donuts ever shot up in a mass shooting. Because they have the proper amount of defense there. Because they have people there with guns. Why do you think the mass shootings only happen where guns are not? Because they don't have the appropriate amount of defense. That's proof positive, and that's exactly what Madison is telling us right here, only on a grander scale. How could a readiness for war in time of peace be safely prohibited unless we could prohibit, in like manner, the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? The means of security can only be regulated by the means and the danger of attack. They will, in fact, be ever determined by these rules and by no others. It is in vain to oppose constitutional barriers to the impulse of self-preservation. It is worse than in vain because it plants in the Constitution itself necessary usurpations of power, every precedent of which is a gem of unnecessary and multiplied repetitions. Think about gun laws. Hello? Have these legislatures never read 41? This is a true principle. Take the same thing and put it to our Second Amendment, and like in Michigan, the Democrat legislature up there is trying to make something they call assault weapons, which I don't know what those are, and neither do they, illegal, and all kinds of other stuff. And they said, well, this is just the beginning. Their eventual thing is they want gun confiscation. What are they doing? They're making everybody in danger, right? Because nobody has the requisite defense for themselves.
Did you know that in Mexico it's illegal for citizens to have firearms?
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And that's why you're seeing everywhere fall to the most popular form of government, which is an oligarchy of socialism, which is exactly where they're trying to push us with the New World Order. So yeah, that's one of the hallmarks to taking a people over, is to take their guns. Because they always go, well, you know, we're worried about mass shootings and everything. I'm not worried about that, because throughout history, all the way back to the garden, you can go all the way back to the Old Testament, governments throughout history have killed more of their own people than a warring country has of their people. Governments are the ones that shouldn't have guns, period. So, where did I end up on that?
If one nation.
Okay, thank you. If one nation maintains constantly a disciplined army ready for the service of ambition or revenge, it obliges the most pacific nations who may be within the reach of its enterprises to take corresponding precautions. The 15th century was the unhappy epoch of military establishments in the time of peace. See, history is important. They were introduced by Charles VII of France. All Europe has followed or been forced into the example. Had the example not been followed by other nations, all Europe must long ago have worn the chains of a universal monarch. A new world order. Were every nation except France now to disband its peace establishments, the same event might follow. The veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her the mistress of the world. So history actually points out to that. So if you have one nation that's starting to build up a huge military, what does that force other nations to do? It's the arms race. Well, we think it just started happening in the 1920s. Well, the arms race has been going on since the 15th century, hasn't it? You think it's going to stop? Nope. Read the Old Testament. You had the arms race there too, right? Towns and cities were trying to build bigger, stronger, taller walls. For what? For defense. They didn't have them there because they needed to know where they lived. Everybody knew where they lived. They needed them for defense. So now he's starting to talk about Rome. Well, what do we know about Rome? They conquered just about every country at one time, right? Because they had a huge military and they spent huge money on the military, and other countries couldn't spend as much. And if they didn't have the requisite defense, then they would fall to Rome. Let's go on. Not the less true is it that the liberties of Rome proved the final victim to her military triumphs, and that the liberties of Europe, as far as they are ever existed, have, with few exceptions, been the price of her military establishments. A standing force, therefore, is dangerous at the same time that it may be a necessary provision. So what do we know about Rome? Their military got so big that they were crushed under its size. What do we know about France? Same thing. Same thing. So what he's saying is, as these countries build up, we have to have the requisite defense. But we shouldn't have a huge military, because what will happen? Same thing that has happened throughout history. When the military gets so big, they are crushed under their weight. Think about that. A standing force, therefore, is a dangerous at the same time that it may be a necessary provision. So we need a certain amount. Remember, I told you this whole thing is about balancing government. Too much government is tyranny. Too little government is anarchy. It's all about having the right amount of government. Military power is the same way. Too much, and it will crush the country under its weight. Too little, and the country will fall to a stronger military. So it's all about the balance of getting the right amount. A standing force, therefore, I already read that. On the smallest scale, it has its inconveniences. On an extensive scale, its consequences may be fatal. You think Lindsey Graham and McConnell need to hear that one sentence? You think a whole bunch of people in Washington, D.C. need to hear that one sentence? I think so. On any scale, it is an object of laudable circumspection and precaution. A wise nation will combine all these considerations. Well, we're not a wise nation anymore. I think we went stupid. And whilst it does not rashly preclude itself from any resource which may become essential to its safety, will exert all its prudence in diminishing both the necessity and the danger of resorting to one which may be inauspicious to its liberties. The clearest marks of this prudence are stamped on the proposed Constitution. So there again, had we been following the Constitution, we wouldn't be where we're at. The Union itself, which it cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. America united with a handful of troops or without a single soldier exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited, with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. It was remarked on a former occasion that the want of this pretext had saved the liberties of one nation in Europe, being rendered by her insular situation and her maritime resources impregnable to the armies of her neighbors. The rulers of Great Britain have never been able, by real or artificial dangers, to cheat the public into an extensive peace establishment. The distance of the United States from the powerful nations of the world gives them the same happy security. A dangerous establishment can never be necessary or plausible so long as they continue a united people. But let it never for a moment be forgotten that they are indebted for this advantage to the Union alone. Again, everything comes back to the Union. There's safety in numbers. The moment of its dissolution will be the date of a new order of things. A new order of things. The fears of the weaker or the ambition of the stronger states or confederacies will set the same example in the new as Charles VII did in the old world. So right here he's starting to say, if you do not want this nation to fall to the same fate as the city-states of Europe, then the union is most important. And in that union, if every state has the same sovereign powers as a country for war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, we run a danger of falling into the same state as Europe. And because the union is the safety, this is why we need the federal government and why we need to give certain requisite powers. We need to delegate it to them so that the union stays safe and that we've balanced what we need in defense against what the possible offense is against us. Does that make sense? This is absolute sheer genius, is what it is. The example will be followed here from the same motives which produced universal imitation there. Instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantage which Great Britain has derived from hers, the face of America will be but a copy of that of the continent of Europe. Again, it will present liberty everywhere crushed between standing armies and perpetual taxes. I know one Federalist paper our entire government needs to read, right? Taxation's theft. The fortunes of disunited America will be even more disastrous than those of Europe. The sources of evil in the latter are confined to her own limits. No superior powers of another quarter of the globe intrigue among her rival nations, inflame their mutual animosities, and render them the instruments of foreign ambition, jealousy, and revenge. In America, the miseries springing from her internal jealousies, contentions, and wars would form a part only of her lot. A plentiful addition of evils would have their source in that relation in which Europe stands to this quarter of the earth, and which no other quarter of the earth bears to Europe. That makes such perfect sense. We didn't want the United States to become the city-states of Europe. We didn't want a superpower army. We needed to maintain a navy, but we needed the ability to raise an army when we needed heavy defense. But the militia provided the initial defense. And then from that militia, then after the legislature votes for an act of war, then the president becomes the commander-in-chief and can call forth the militia to put together a standing army for an adequate defense. This is so beautiful. I mean, it's absolute genius. And during the progressive period of the 20th century, we flushed it all down the toilet. This picture of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty ought to have it ever before his eyes, that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America, and be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. Next to the effectual establishment of the Union, the best possible precaution against danger from standing armies is a limitation of the term for which revenue may be appropriated to their support. So they knew that it costs money for an army, right? So how do you keep an army, a huge army?